Canada is a country of almost impossible dimensions. Nearly 10 million square kilometers of territory, dense boreal forests, endless prairies, snow-capped mountains, coastlines battered by the Atlantic and the Pacific, and scattered across provinces and territories that most people will never visit. There are places that were once alive, loud, full of people, dreams, and promise. Cities that disappeared. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, sometimes within months, sometimes within weeks. Places where there were once schools, churches, dance halls, hotels, local newspapers. Places that today are covered in brush, swallowed by the bush, or simply wiped off the map as if they never existed. These are called ghost towns, and Canada has hundreds of them. But what makes some of these stories even more haunting is the speed with which everything ended. There was no slow goodbye, no gradual decline over decades. There was full, bustling life, and then, almost overnight, total silence. The reasons vary. Mines that ran dry, devastating fires, government decisions, natural disasters, disease, war, and sometimes something even harder to explain, simply the end of a collective dream. In this video, you're going to discover 10 of these towns. 10 places that genuinely existed, that had names, streets, residents, stories, and that disappeared in ways that still cause disbelief today. Some you can still visit. Others no longer exist even as ruins. But all of them share one thing, a story that deserves to be told. Number 1. Barkerville, British Columbia. Few places in Canada symbolize the gold rush quite like Barkerville. Founded in 1862 in the mountains of British Columbia, the town sprang up from almost nothing when a miner named Billy Barker struck an impressive quantity of gold along the banks of Williams Creek. The news spread like wildfire, and within months, thousands of people converged on that remote valley deep in the Caribou Mountains. At its peak, Barkerville was the largest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. There were more than 100 commercial establishments, restaurants, hotels, a local newspaper, dentists, lawyers, and doctors. The town never slept. Gold was abundant, and the promise of quick wealth drew people from every continent. Europeans, Americans, Chinese, Australians, Caribbeans. But gold has one fundamental problem. It runs out. As the years passed and the deposits were exhausted, the flow of people reversed. Those who found no fortune left first. Then came the merchants, the doctors, the lawyers. In 1870, a massive fire destroyed much of the town. It was rebuilt, but it never recovered its original glory. By the early 20th century, Barkerville was little more than a shadow of what it had been. Today, ironically, Barkerville is one of the most visited historic sites in British Columbia, preserved as a provincial historic park. Actors performing 19th century scenes walk its wooden boardwalks. But the real life that existed there, the shouting from the mine shafts, the smell of gunpowder and mud, the raw hope of people who bet everything, that never came back. Number 2. Sandon, British Columbia. If Barkerville was born from gold, Sandon was born from silver. Located in a steep, narrow valley in the interior of British Columbia, Sandon was founded in 1892 during a silver rush in the Slocan region. Within just a few years, it became a proper town with more than 5,000 residents, 24 saloons, 2 newspapers, an opera house, casinos, luxury hotels, and even electricity. That last part was extraordinarily rare for such a remote community at the time. But the story of Sandon is a story of repeated blows. The first came in 1900, when a devastating fire destroyed much of the town in just a few hours. The residents rebuilt, determined. The second blow came in 1955, when a catastrophic flood swept away what remained of the town. This time, there was no reason to rebuild. The silver had run out decades earlier, and the population was a fraction of what it had been at its peak. Today, in Sandon, there are literally a few rotting wooden structures crumbling between the trees, and the sound of the river that once flooded everything. It's a place that history enthusiasts visit in silence, trying to imagine how that narrow, wild valley once held a town that believed itself permanent. Number 3. Anyox, British Columbia. Anyox is a name few people know, but it deserves special attention because its story is different from almost every other ghost town in Canada. It wasn't built by prospectors chasing quick riches. It was built by industry, specifically by the Granby Consolidated Mining, Smelting and Power Company, which erected an industrial-scale copper smelter in a remote fjord in northern British Columbia. At the height of operations in the 1920s, Anyox had more than 2,500 residents. There was a school, a hospital, a movie theater, an ice skating rink, a baseball diamond, a hotel, shops. It was a company town. The corporation owned everything, and every resident was, in one way or another, an employee or dependent of the smelter. When copper prices collapsed during the Great Depression, the company simply shut its doors in 1935. Overnight, without warning, without an alternative, without a plan B, workers and their families were told that operations were finished and that they needed to leave. Within weeks, Anyox was empty. What came next was even more dramatic. In 1942, a major fire destroyed virtually every remaining structure. Nature did the rest. Today, Anyox is accessible only by boat. What you find there are fragments of rusted metal, concrete foundations covered in moss, and the dense rainforest of British Columbia's north coast slowly reclaiming what was always hers. Number 4. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. Few stories illustrate the fragility of single-resource towns quite as clearly as Uranium City, in northern Saskatchewan. The town was founded in the 1950s to support uranium extraction during the nuclear age, a period when the mineral was considered both strategic and extraordinarily valuable. At its peak in the 1970s, Uranium City had more than 4,500 residents. There were all the amenities of a modern northern Canadian town: schools, a hospital, a public pool, a community center, an airport. It was a functional, planned community, with established families and a tight-knit social fabric. In 1982, Eldorado Nuclear, the Crown Corporation responsible for the mining, announced the closure of operations. The decision came swiftly, reflecting the collapse in uranium prices and a shift in the global energy landscape. The impact was immediate and brutal. Within less than a year, the population of Uranium City dropped from over 4,000 to fewer than 200 people. Houses were abandoned with furniture still inside. Cars were left sitting in garages. Churches, schools, and the hospital were shuttered. The town didn't disappear entirely. It still exists today with a minimal population. But the Uranium City that existed in 1981 vanished so quickly that oral historians are still interviewing former residents trying to document what actually happened. Number 5. Bankhead, Alberta. Located in the dramatic shadow of the Rocky Mountains, just a few kilometers from Banff, Bankhead was a coal mining town that existed between 1903 and 1922. Its setting was extraordinary, surrounded by some of the most spectacular scenery on the planet. But its life was short, and its end was swift. The town was built by the Canadian Pacific Railway to extract coal to fuel its locomotives. At its peak, it had more than 1,000 residents, many of them European immigrants. Polish, Slovak, Italian, Welsh, who brought their cultures, their languages, and their traditions with them. There was a school that taught in multiple languages, a Catholic church, a Protestant church, a football club, and a brass band. But the relationship between the company and its workers was never harmonious. Repeated strikes and labor disputes marked the final years of Bankhead. In 1922, the CPR decided to shut down operations. Workers and their families were given short notice. The structures were systematically demolished or removed. Today, within Banff National Park, there are trails that lead to the ruins of Bankhead. Concrete foundations, fragments of rusted machinery, and interpretive plaques tell the story of a community that lived and worked there and vanished over 100 years ago. The irony of a dead town existing inside one of the most visited parks in the world is not lost on anyone who goes looking for it. Number 6. Cobalt, Ontario. The story of Cobalt, in northern Ontario, begins with an accident. In 1903, workers constructing the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway discovered silver in large quantities along the shores of Cobalt Lake. The news spread fast, and within just a few years the region had become the world's largest silver producer. Cobalt was not a town of lone prospectors. It was an industrial city, with major mining companies, engineers, geologists, and a population that reached more than 10,000 people. There were banks, fine hotels, a modern hospital, and a surprisingly rich cultural life for such a remote northern community. The decline of Cobalt was slower than that of other towns on this list, but no less final. As silver became harder to extract and prices fell, the companies moved on. The population dwindled through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. What remained was a smaller, aging town, living in the memory of what it had been. Cobalt exists to this day. It's not exactly a ghost town, but it holds one remarkable distinction. The wealth and expertise accumulated there largely financed the future gold discoveries at Porcupine and Kirkland Lake, two of the most significant gold mines in Canadian history. Cobalt faded, but its legacy built other cities. Number 7. Dawson City, Yukon. Dawson City is perhaps the most famous name on this list, and it deserves a special place here, because its story is simultaneously the grandest and the most melancholy of any Canadian gold rush. Founded in 1896, when gold was discovered in the Klondike, Dawson City exploded in size to become, at its peak in 1898, the largest city west of Winnipeg, with more than 30,000 residents. Think about that for a moment. 30,000 people. In the Yukon, at the end of the 19th century, people who arrived on foot through the brutal Chilkoot Pass in the dead of winter. People who built boats and sailed down frozen rivers. People who staked their entire lives on a handful of gold nuggets that might never materialize. Dawson City had opera, daily newspapers, 2 theaters, French restaurants, hotels with polished hardwood floors, chess champions, poets, and dance hall girls. It was a real, intense, vibrant city, alive in a way few places ever are. And then, in 1899, gold was discovered in Nome, Alaska. Within months, tens of thousands of people packed up and left. The population of Dawson dropped below 8,000 by 1900, and kept falling. The city didn't vanish completely. It exists today with just over 1,000 residents. But the Dawson City of 1898, that improbable metropolis at the edge of the known world, disappeared almost overnight. What makes Dawson City even more fascinating is what the permafrost has preserved beneath its streets. Archaeologists still uncover everyday objects from the 19th century, perfectly conserved in the frozen ground. Bottles, shoes, letters, coins. The town buried its own history under frozen earth. And that history is being uncovered, literally, one object at a time. Number 8. Canmore. The original mining town, Alberta. Canmore today is a thriving, sought-after community at the gateway to Banff National Park, known for its luxury resorts, upscale restaurants, and as a base camp for mountain sports. But few of the tourists strolling its streets realize they're walking over the foundations of a coal mining town that essentially died in the middle of the 20th century. The mining Canmore, the one that existed to supply the Canadian Pacific Railway with coal, began to die when steam locomotives were replaced by diesel in the 1950s. The coal mine closed in 1979, and the town that had existed almost entirely to serve it was left without an apparent purpose. What happened in Canmore is rare in the history of Canadian ghost towns. It was reborn. Its proximity to the Rocky Mountains and to Banff transformed it into a tourist and residential destination for people who wanted mountain living without Banff prices. But the town that exists today is so different from the original mining community that in a very real sense, the historic Canmore disappeared just as completely as the others. It was simply replaced by something entirely new, something unrecognizable to anyone who lived there during the coal years. Number 9. Ocean Falls, British Columbia. Ocean Falls has one of the most peculiar stories on this list. It wasn't built by miners, but by a different industry entirely, pulp and paper. Situated in a remote inlet on the central coast of British Columbia, accessible only by boat or float plane, Ocean Falls was for decades a model company town, considered one of the most pleasant places to live on the entire BC coast. At its peak in the 1960s and early 1970s, it had nearly 3,000 residents. There was a secondary school, a hospital, a hotel, a movie theater, tennis courts, a heated indoor pool, and a central heating system that ran on waste heat from the paper mill. The heavy rainfall in the region, Ocean Falls, is one of the wettest places in Canada, guaranteed cheap, abundant hydroelectric power. In 1973, Crown Zellerbach announced the closure of the mill. The provincial government took over operations temporarily. But by 1980, the final decision was made. Ocean Falls would be abandoned. The departure was organized but no less painful. Families who had lived there for generations had to choose what to take and what to leave behind. Schools, churches, and the hospital were shut down. Today, Ocean Falls has fewer than 50 residents, people who refused to leave, who built their lives around that remote place and decided they were staying no matter what. The swimming pool, remarkably, still operates. Number 10. The first gas town, British Columbia. The most surprising story on this list, and perhaps the least known, is about a place that isn't exactly a ghost town in the traditional sense, because it was completely destroyed and replaced by another city built right on top of its ashes. In 1886, the small town of Granville, which had grown up around a harbor on the British Columbia coast and was known informally as Gastown, after its founder, Gassy Jack Dayton, was officially incorporated and renamed Vancouver. The new city was being built quickly, with the promise of becoming the western terminus of the Canadian Pacific Railway. On June 13, 1886, just 2 months after official incorporation, a fire broke out on the edge of town during land clearing operations. What happened over the following hours was catastrophic. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fueled by strong winds and the dry timber of newly built structures. In less than 45 minutes, the entire city was destroyed. Estimates suggest between 20 and 80 people died. Records are imprecise because many of the victims were undocumented laborers. What makes this story truly extraordinary is what happened next. The residents didn't flee. They didn't abandon the site. The day after the fire, while the ashes were still warm, tents were already going up and plans were being made to rebuild. Within weeks, reconstruction was underway. Within months, Vancouver was standing again, this time built with more brick and less timber. The first Vancouver, the one that existed for just 2 months as an official city, but for years as a settlement, vanished in a single afternoon. The city that exists today, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan in Canada, was built on top of its ashes. In a very real sense, all of modern Vancouver stands on a ghost town. Tracing the history of these 10 towns is more than an exercise in nostalgia or historical curiosity. It's a mirror. Each one of them existed because there was a reason, a resource, a company, a transportation route, a promise of wealth. And each one disappeared when that reason ceased to exist. The most immediate lesson is about the fragility of places built around a single thing. Towns built around a mine last as long as the mine lasts. Towns built around a factory last as long as the factory lasts. When the foundation goes, whether from resource exhaustion, economic shifts, corporate decisions, or natural disaster, the town goes with it, often with a speed that leaves residents no time to process what's happening. But there's a second lesson, more subtle, more human. In every one of these towns there were real people, families who built homes, who planted gardens, who buried parents and grandparents, who baptized children, who made plans for the future. People who believed they were building something permanent. Researchers conducting oral history interviews with former residents of Uranium City, Anyox, and Ocean Falls consistently report the same thing. Decades later, these people still dream about the towns they lost. They still describe streets, houses, and faces with a sharpness that is striking. The place never left them, even after they left the place. And perhaps the most important thing we can do for these towns, for Barkerville and Sandon, for Anyox and Uranium City, for Bankhead and Dawson, for Canmore and Ocean Falls, for the first gas town and all the others that didn't make this list, is simply to remember that they existed, that they had life, that they had a name. Because a place that is remembered never fully disappears.